Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. This podcast addresses many topics around mental health and sexuality. It may not be suitable for minors. Some topics may elicit a trigger or emotional response, so please care for yourself accordingly. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer Podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions, and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes is by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
Hello, everyone. This is Natasha Helfer, and this is the Natasha Helfer Podcast, where we go after shame in any way, shape, and form that we can to help you have better relational health, better mental health, better sexual health. And so that's the agenda for the podcast. And today I'm excited to have Rachel Larsen on the show. She is one of my providers at Symmetry Counseling. We thought we'd kind of do a bit of a role reversal, that instead of me interviewing a guest, that Rachel will interview me. For several reasons. I have been receiving a lot of requests for how to work with people that are struggling with what I call the porn dilemma. This is usually heterosexual couples. This is usually couples that come from some type of conservative or religious upbringing, although that's not always the case, because there's a lot of myths and misinformation that even kind of more mainstream couples might be dealing with in regards to distress around porn use and how porn use shows up in their marriages or their long-term relationships and how they feel about those kinds of things. So this has been an area of interest for me for over 20 years, given the population I typically work with, which are people from religiously conservative communities, whether it's the Mormon community, the Catholic community, the evangelical community. Those are all communities I'm very familiar with and have had clients throughout the years. So without further ado, I'll turn the time over to Rachel to basically, as a more beginner clinician, I want to give you the opportunity to kind of ask questions and to say, hey, I noticed this stuff coming up for me too. And what are the things that we can do to be helpful as clinicians, especially from the lens, sexual health lens, a sex positive lens. And I think I'll just say one more thing. I think this is so pivotally important when younger, inexperienced clinicians are willing to learn about this, because there is so much misinformation and actually unethical and ineffective treatments that are actually pushed by licensed clinicians. And unfortunately, we've had quite a bit of that kind of brought to media attention with, for example, the Jodi Hildebrand and Ruby Franke case here in Utah, where Jodi Hildebrand was one of these therapists that created programs that were very, very unethical in helping people, trying to help people with the porn dilemma. We also have personalities like Maurice Harker, who was, the person who was involved with the Sons of Helaman, founding the Sons of Helaman program, which is another kind of addiction-esque type of treatment approach. And this has been something that I've been very passionate about for so many years, because I see so much unnecessary harm and so much drastic misinformation being disseminated and so much fear and panic that leads to what I see as very unnecessary tragedies and premature divorce and sexual dysfunction amongst couples, and just so much story around what these things mean when people don't have accurate information to make decisions from. So that's my little soapbox. Rachel, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. By way of introduction, for those who don't know me, just probably most people, like Natasha said, I'm a newer clinician. I am a clinical mental health counselor, so that's my background in training. And I am both new to the therapy world, a brand new baby therapist, but also newer to symmetry. And it's been a really, really interesting transition when looking at what my clients are dealing with and the way that things are affecting them, especially with their sexual health. And so much of it stems from sexual understanding or misunderstanding, or stuntedness that occurred in the normal human development. And so misunderstanding some of these concepts, it, like you said, is creating a lot of unnecessary suffering and in some cases, damage to relationships that is preventable. And so, and it's such a hot button topic. There's a lot of feelings surrounding it. And so I'm excited to be able to speak with you about clinically what it means, the evidence-based research that we have access to, and just being able to like openly and safely discuss something that feels so emotionally charged and at times dangerous. And so just to really kind of open up. So I'm excited because there's a lot that's coming up for me in what I'm seeing with clients, and just to be able to like talk openly about like, what does that mean? Like, how are we going to engage with this in our community with these mental health discussions? So, okay. So I have some questions already, like ready for you. I hope you're like fine with them. You can say pass if you want to. Anyway, I think one of the first things we have to establish that I have noticed is when you're talking with people about hot button topics that bring up a lot of emotion, and you're engaging with someone that has deep rooted beliefs about the topic, it's really, really important to define what the parameters are so that everybody knows we're talking about the same thing. So define what each person like views the thing as. So since there is a lot of talk about addiction regarding pornography, and then in the mental health world, we would use the word compulsion, which is different than addiction. And then there is a term called normative use, or normative behaviors that we also use in the mental health community, but that's not usually that's not something that usually comes up in casual conversation, the word normative or whatever. Can you speak to us about the definitions that you would use in this discussion for the parameters of what is addiction, what is compulsive, what is normative?
Yeah, and maybe even before I hit on that, I'll kind of address what you're talking about, deep-seated values and beliefs, right? So I think oftentimes our values and our beliefs are formatted through a lot of different things, whether it's our culture, our ethnicity, our religious upbringings, our families, right? Extended families and families of origin that, raised us with certain beliefs. And I think everybody has the right to their values and beliefs. And so I just want to say right off the bat, it is not my job to change somebody's values. It is not really my job to change their beliefs. What I'm hopeful for is that people can make informed decisions about their values and their beliefs through accurate information, as accurate as we can potentially think of information being accurate. And the way we do that in the social science fields is primarily through what we call evidence-based information, meaning that something has been researched and studied. And that typically doesn't mean one study. That means usually a robust, types of studies, so that if a study comes out with new information, usually it's very common that study will be repeated by other people or by the same people who conducted the initial study to see whether or not this holds up. And so it's not that social science hasn't gotten information wrong. It definitely has. But what's lovely about this kind of scientific method is that over time, it trends to correct itself. And so in the field of sexual health in particular, there is a lot of difference between what we see in research as actually being evidence-based, like, yes, we can see this correlation or this causation, versus what is being seen as far as even beliefs in trainings. And so even mental health professionals themselves will have oftentimes received biased or uninformed training because science hasn't quite caught up with the training. Like a typical example is that for a long time in the DSM, which is what we usually look at as kind of the most recent evidence-based standards of treatment for all the different kinds of mental health disorders, we had homosexuality listed as a mental health disorder all the way up into the 1970s. And mental health professionals were being trained in their programs, in their master's degree programs, in regards to things like conversion therapy. And that was seen as normal or accurate treatment. And in the mental health field, we caused tons of harm to the LGBTQ community through this quote unquote scientific lens. So we have to be very humble, within the field to say, what could we potentially be getting wrong right now? At the same time, that doesn't mean I want everybody to be like, see, you can't trust science, because science, more than any other type of process we have out there, especially when it comes to beliefs, has a higher capacity to autocorrect than other types of groupthink and other types of cultural pressures to have certain types of beliefs and values. So I just kind of want to state that I've taken this topic very seriously. I have now almost been a clinician for 30 years. And this issue in particular started really kind of coming up more than ever about, I would say the early 2000s, when we started to have more access to internet in particular, and more people had more readily available access to what we might call sexually explicit materials, which is colloquially called pornography. And the distress that this started bringing up because it was so much more readily available than it ever had before.
Symmetry is now offering ketamine services. To find out more, go to simcounseling.com/ketamine-services.
And so we've seen a lot of interesting, reactions to this from church leaders, from the public, from mental health professionals themselves. And one thing I want to also clarify right from the get-go is that most of us who are mental health clinicians really do not receive almost any, and definitely not robust training in human sexuality. And out of all the things that we've gotten wrong as a social science type of space, we, just like the rest of the culture, have leaned towards pathologizing sexuality when it does not show up in culturally normative ways. And that's why we have a history of pathologizing homosexuality. We have a history of pathologizing fetishes. We have a history of pathologizing BDSM. And, throughout the years, we've become much better able to see through a much more diverse lens about how the human sexual experience shows up. And we have a lot better information, but that information is not necessarily something that's being taught in most social work programs or, master's level programs where clinicians get their initial training. And so I do want to state that I have been through pretty much 2 years of additional training to become certified as a sex therapist that gives me a different type of authority than maybe a therapist who has not been through that kind of training. It's a specialization, right? And so if you're listening to all the different therapists out there, I think it is really important as you're deciding what type of information to trust, because one of my biggest frustrations is the other therapists who are also offering misinformation is what kind of training have they had, and what kind of credibility is this person I'm going to listen to. So having said all that as kind of a disclaimer, I do want to talk a little bit about the language that we use. So the term addiction is not even something that's very much used, even when you think about kind of classically what we might use that term for, which is substances. The terminology really in the DSM is substance dependence. That's the terminology. That's what you get diagnosed with. That's what the code that you put in for your diagnosis says. So we're not even really using the term addiction, even from a clinical perspective. And the term addiction has quite a bit of baggage in regards to a lot of shame, even with something as difficult to treat and as legitimate as substance dependence. when you start talking about the terms addicts, and this person is an addict, and this person or that person is an addict, there's a lot of shame that goes along with that type of languaging. And back in the 1980s, when we were going through the AIDS epidemic, and there was a bit of a panic in regards to contracting AIDS, and we had a lot of shifts and kind of going from a sexual revolution in the 70s to now this AIDS epidemic panic, and things really kind of began to shut down, including abstinence only education in the public school systems. There was a person called Patrick Carnes who took this model that seemed to be helpful with people who were dealing with substance dependence, and kind of borrowed all of that language, all of that addiction language, to now look at sexual behaviors. And the reality is that if the sexual behavior did not fall under a heteronormative kind of, a macho-normative, that you're, in a primary relationship, typically a heterosexual relationship that's committed, and as long as you're doing sexual acts that, for whatever reason, the culture deems normal at the time, if you didn't fall under that parameter, you pretty quickly got qualified, through this kind of one man's perspective of this model as a sex or porn addict. And this would include things like masturbation. This would include things like being a homosexual. This would include things like being transgender. This would include things even amongst couples where maybe they would like to play with, BDSM themes or kink, because it didn't fall under what we as a culture decided was normal or good sex, and it's a little bit risque or taboo. You get this addict kind of label placed upon you, and the treatments to these addictions, as they were called, were very much just kind of, this is what we think would be helpful, but not necessarily what we've called gold standard evidence-based treatment approach. And to this day, the addiction model for sexual concerns does not have evidence-based results showing that it is an effective way to treat distress around sexual issues. So we have two big issues with the addiction model is, and I like how Zoom makes balloons go up. Anyway, for those of you who are watching, there's two issues. One is that you have an ineffective treatment that is being widely referred to by clinicians all over this country, but primarily in conservative areas of the country. So it's so interesting to see that you're much more likely to be diagnosed a sex addict or porn addict and be treated for sex addiction if you live in the conservative, more religiously leaning states of this country, what we might call the Bible Belt, right? Or what we might call the Book of Mormon Belt, and not so much in other areas. In fact, having been a trainer of professionals for, half of my career, it's always so interesting to see so many clinicians look at me with this look like, what are you even talking about? This is not even something that we treat or see, or, clients are not coming in talking about being a porn addict, and we're not referring to porn addiction. And where is this happening? And how is this happening? Where, of course, in other areas of the country where I've presented, people are very upset with me because I'm, in essence, debunking the porn addiction model, right? And they themselves are porn addiction therapists. So there's a big rift, even in the mental health community, about how we talk about these issues. But I do want to share that the research shows that both the public and the mental health professionals who buy into this addiction model tend to come from conservative and religious communities themselves, including the therapists. So there's a bias there. So addiction is actually not a term that is accurate to use, even if there are legitimate, severe problems with somebody's sexual behavior where it's feels out of control, or it's compulsive, or it's impulsive. Addiction is not the term that we would use to accurately diagnose somebody, and it is not the type of treatment that is considered effective for treating those kinds of issues.
I'm so glad that you brought that up. I think it's really important to understand that even in the ASECT, which is like what would you call it, the governing body over sexual mental health practices and treatments and trainings and certifications and all that kind of stuff, they also do not use that language. They do not recognize sex addiction as a clinical term. That is not a thing that is used. And I think it's also important to note that treatments that are used, if they have been proven to not be effective, are automatically unethical. You cannot use a treatment that doesn't work. And so when you brought up conversion therapy, for instance, and that there was never any evidence that that was helping, that alone should disqualify it. But there was also evidence that it was harming. And so that's another ethical thing. And so when you have to look at shame-based approaches or even just inaccuracies in the language use, like you're talking about with addiction, first of all, you want to see if it's causing harm, obviously, but if it's also not working, if there's evidence to show that this is not really what that model is, the fact that someone superimposed the model of addiction onto sexual health does not make it true. And so, like in the science world, like if something is true with a capital T, there's always evidence, always replicable. You can see it leaves a trail of evidence everywhere if it's a true thing. And so when you look at that, there is no evidence to support this type of model being imposed on this area of mental health. As a professional, you have to be humble enough to say, okay, where's the bias lie? And how do we need to change and shift it to address what's actually happening and not what we might be afraid is happening or that we have been taught to believe is happening, but like to look at the evidence and say what is actually happening and how do we apply a different model.
Yes. And I will say that at kind of towards the beginning of my career, because I did not know better and I was getting a lot of this information from what I thought were credible clinicians, I was myself practicing similar modalities and interventions that you would find if you went to like a CSAT, which is a certified sex addiction therapist, which sounds really credible, right? That's a certification that many clinicians go and get, where they are taught how to basically, provide this addiction model. But it is not a certification that is really offered by a governing board, like you mentioned, ASECT, which is the American Association for Sexual Educators, Counselors, and Therapists. It is a governing board that disagrees often, that challenges each other often, that has a lot of criteria about how things get through in regards to policy and best standards of treatment. And whereas you have certifications offered by a clinician who comes up with a good idea and then trains a bunch of people, but there's no governing board. And sometimes those certifications can be okay. Like, for example, for anybody who's heard of John Gottman, he's done a lot of evidence-based research to support his modality of therapy, which is something you can get certified in, right? So you may have heard of a Gottman certified therapist, and that does have evidence to back it up, even though there is no governing board with John Gottman either. That's a one-man show that he has created something that hopefully is useful to clinicians. So that's similar to this CSAT certification. It is not offered by a governing board. It is offered by a one-man show. And there isn't the effectiveness that you would want to see offered in that type of treatment approach showing up in the research. And that's why both ASECT and the Mormon Mental Health Association have very well-written position statements that we'll maybe add here in the notes of this podcast that help you understand why these modalities are not effective. And I think this is very confusing to the public because if you ask people who've been through these types of treatments, and I have worked with many people post these types of addiction treatments, they will say usually that at the beginning it felt very helpful. It felt very helpful. You had somebody telling you, what they thought the problem was, which usually aligns with the kind of the biases and the values of a conservative community. Sure. And because, of course, in conservative communities, you usually have more conservative values around sexuality, which again, it's fine to have those values, right? But if you think about maybe a church, a culture or a community that you don't necessarily align with, and you see some of their values, like, for example, wearing a hijab or something, if you're a Muslim woman, most Christians are not going to see it as clinically relevant that if that person no longer wants to wear a hijab, she should go get hijab treatment, right? And that's the difference. It's one thing to honor somebody's values and to say, absolutely, you have a right to that belief. You have a right to wear or not wear a hijab, and that may or may not cause distress in your marriage, depending on whether or not your partner agrees or doesn't agree with your choices. But we are not going to turn that into a clinical issue and now call you sick and give you a diagnostic code because you are not adhering to a cultural or religious value, right? That is different. And that is what we here in the United States have had a lot of trouble separating between, because we do come from a religiously, like a religiously founded country, and we have a lot of religious bias, and that doesn't escape the medical and the social science world. That has had to kind of, come through in different ways, even with something as difficult as suicide. We used to see that as a sin, right? And a sickness. Now we see it as a symptom of depression, right? We understand it much more than like you've got a demonic possession or something like that. So it's very important to start understanding, where do religious beliefs and values begin and end, and where do clinical issues begin and end, and therefore make much better informed decisions for whatever it is that you're coming in for distress with. So yeah, that's I think that's really important to understand where this, why people might find it helpful. And they usually find it helpful because somebody is, basically agreeing with their value system. They're saying there's a problem that needs to be treated, because, of course, couples where there is a discrepancy in their values do have distress. Oftentimes, a partner may feel very betrayed. Oftentimes, there's secrecy around this issue. Oftentimes, it erodes trust. There are legitimate reasons why a couple might have distress when their behavior is not aligned with their agreements or their values, and that causes a lot of difficulty and severe pain for both parties for different reasons. And you go into a clinician and they're saying, oh yeah, this is the problem and this is how we're going to treat it, and you're sick, and this is the treatment plan, and sign up and pay for all this money and we'll help you out. What's really interesting is that insurance does not cover porn addiction treatment, because again, there's no porn addiction diagnosis. You can't go into the DSM or the ICD and find porn addiction as a diagnosis. Now, something that did happen a few years ago in the ICD-11 was that they added like a sexual compulsivity disorder, which I was very concerned about, and it has played out exactly like I thought it would. Is that because we already have compulsivity disorder, by the way, that's already in the books. So I don't know why we need a special one for sexual compulsivity.
Do we need a subtype there?
I'm not sure why that was necessary, because we can be compulsive about all kinds of behaviors, from everything that we might consider unhealthy, like stealing, to things that we consider healthy, like exercise. You can have a compulsive, unhealthy relationship with something that people might think of as generally healthy, like reading their scriptures or exercising or praying. And if you have OCD or have some type of compulsive factor, any behavior can become unhealthy and unbalanced in a human being's life. But what happened is that because now there is a code for sexual compulsivity, all of these religiously biased therapists and sex addiction therapists have basically just switched from sex addiction to the sexual compulsivity. And now they do have this code, and they can, basically use it to, do a session treatment. But again, the assessment there is highly suspect, because the amount of people in the state of Utah, for example, or in the state of Kansas who are getting diagnosed with this sexual compulsivity disorder compared to people in every other area of, of the world that uses these kinds of diagnoses is completely different, because therapists are inappropriately diagnosing people due to their own biases and their own training, which is not accurate and effective.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm glad to bring that up. Especially, I think it's really important to understand that there are compulsions out there and that pornography use could be a compulsive behavior, but it's the same thing as any other compulsive behavior that we're talking about. You can have compulsive behavior surrounding food. You can have compulsive behavior surrounding checking your text messages if you've got OCD related to relationships. Like there's so many things that you can be compelled to do based on obsessions or whatever, that could otherwise be normative, but it coming from a biased perspective of looking at, okay, anytime you engage in just the word pornography automatically equals compulsion or automatically equals addiction is rooted in bias and not rooted in evidence. We've got to look at the overarching umbrella of what is causing a compulsion, and not just the very thing you're feeling compelled to do, because it's not always going to be based. It's not every time someone gambles that it's a compulsive behavior. There are normative uses for gambling, just like there's compulsive uses for gambling. So looking at that, I think that's the most important thing as a clinician to understand when you're looking at evidence-based practices, is like what kind of bias is informing the language. So I do want to also talk about some common misconceptions that people have that make them so afraid, because a lot of this stuff is very fear driven. And so when you engage with a person who is just so terrified about even the word pornography, in our area in the early 2000s, especially with the more widely accessible images for children, for everyone, to have access to sexually explicit images, there was so much fear surrounding even a one-time look, like as if I looked at a sexually explicit thing, therefore I am probably now addicted to it because it changes my brain or it makes me want to look at it more or whatever. And so to be able to speak to what are some common misconceptions that people have that make them so afraid even to talk about it.
Yeah, and I apologize because you're asking great questions, and then I'm already thinking of what I forgot to say in the last question. So I'm going to go back there really quickly, and then I'm going to come back to this. I was starting to talk about how I used to actually do some of this, what I would call ineffective treatment. And pretty quickly, I could see it was ineffective. The goals that we were trying to reach and how we were monitoring for the goals and things like that were just really not working. What I found more than usual in the addiction model treatment is that the person who was supposedly quote unquote addicted, because the fear was so high, which is kind of part of what you're talking about, and the consequences were so high, like potential divorce and potential loss of custody of their children and potential, expulsion from their religious communities, the level of secrecy and dishonesty was high. And I just became one more person to be dishonest with. And so, and I started really realizing that pretty quickly that this model was not working. And then having worked with so many people post addiction treatment for pornography, and how harmful it has been for people, and how this initial hope and initial idea that it was going to be helpful for them ended up not panning out, and continuing the potential risks for dishonesty, for betrayal, for distrust were so high, and the levels of divorce, even went higher because of course, the person who's continuing to feel betrayed and this treatment isn't working eventually is like, well, this is a deal breaker then for me. Is why I'm so concerned about this. So like you said earlier, this isn't just ineffective treatment, it's harmful treatment. It actually causes harm. And there's some research now to show that people who consider themselves addicts, right, or who their partners consider themselves addicts because of these kind of cultural values, and because they don't believe that pornography should be part of their life because of their religious beliefs, tend to have higher levels of distress, higher levels of relational anxiety, higher levels of sexual dysfunction, even though usually the pornography use is less than what we might consider normative for the mainstream population that doesn't necessarily come from those kinds of religious standards and values. So that makes me so upset because I come from this community, right? I come from the Mormon Latter-day Saint community. I love my people. And whenever I see my people being hurt because of misinformation, because of ineffective treatment, I start feeling pretty passionate about this. So I get that I'm coming in with information that sometimes feels risky or feels threatening because I'm not following this model that feels so comfortable within the religious community, that I'm really trying to raise a red flag and say, actually, this is not going to help you in the long term. And let's figure out things that could help you, and take a much more positive and shame-free approach to an issue that, for the most part, is usually a values discrepancy issue. We've got human behavior and we've got values, and a lot of times those don't coincide. And what
They're in conflict. Yeah.
what are you going to do with that? But that's very different than saying one of you is sick and you're going to be sick for the rest of your life, because once an addict, always an addict. And we're going to treat you through this modality that is just ineffective. So I do feel very passionate about this. Okay. So now to your question of really what I think is the porn panic, right? The porn panic. You mentioned children, you mentioned, and there are some concerns. There are some concerns we should have around sexually explicit materials. It's
absolutely
not healthy for children to be, especially, like non-pubescent children, to have access to sexually explicit anything, whether it's walking in on their parents having sex, or whether it's, having pornographic images, or, there's a reason why we have ratings on movies, right? And we're like, this is PG, right, or this is rated R. It's like, this isn't developmentally appropriate material for a young mind that doesn't have the developmental intellectual maturity to know how to handle adult themes, whether that's violence or sex, or, a variety of topics that might cause, when you see the rated R reason why it's rated R, there's several reasons why it could be rated R. And it's not just sexually explicit material that is not necessarily that helpful for young developing minds. At the same time, we have to face that most children and adolescents will have access to sexually explicit material. And it's very easy, and it can happen accidentally. It can happen intentionally, that we have sexually curious children. We have sexually curious teens. It's very easy to go online now and search. I think the first time in my home somebody searched for something, it was like boobies, right? Well, they're curious. Okay. That actually is normal. It's normal for children to be curious about bodies, about sex, about romance, about, all these adult themes, just like they're curious about coffee and driving and, violence and war. I mean, kids are curious. And so how do we talk to our children and be prepared, not that if they come across sexually explicit material, but more than likely when? What is our reaction going to be? How do we teach porn literacy to both children and adolescents? What are the reasons we're giving them? And are we doing that, again, in an educated, shame-free environment? Because if now you are really bringing in your anxiety, your porn panic is coming forward, and you're treating your children and teens like they've done something horribly wrong, or that their life is going to be ruined, and you increase the anxiety response for them around a topic that already has a lot of anxiety around it, because we don't typically know how to talk about sex. What you'll usually get as a result from that is secrecy from your child. They now know that you can't handle their sexuality, so they're going to hide their sexual behaviors and sexual questions and sexual curiosities from you. And you're also going to potentially start that internalized self-loathing, where a child will believe you that there's something wrong with them. And what we actually do know about compulsive sexual behavior is that it is oftentimes seeped in shame. That when we do feel ashamed, truly self-loathing ashamed, and I can't tell you how many times I've literally heard, especially from men, I am a piece of shit. Like, that verbiage has come through my office 500 bajillion times because of this type of sexual shame. You actually increase the probability that they will have less skills and less ability to manage their sexual drives and desires. And so it's really important from an early age as parents to know how to talk to our kids about this in a way that is not not being led by anxiety and fear, that is being led by accurate information, that is led by normalizing curiosity. And just like a kid who's like, why can't I drive when I'm like right now, even though I'm 6, and you're like, oh, honey, that's so cute. Of course you want to drive. You will be able to drive. When that time comes, we will support you and help you learn how to drive, right? And so it's kind of that type of very casual and normative and informed, sexually informed ways to talk to your children about these issues. So
yeah, yeah. And if I may, I have a quick example to share that I've seen often. And that is to have someone who was told something about sexual behavior, whether that was masturbation, whether that was pornography viewing, whether that was sexual exploration as a teen with a partner or something like that. But because of the framework that this is morally wrong, like the moral price tag that was put onto it, they were then taught that would ruin a future relationship. So this added level of anxiety of like, if you engage in pornography use, you won't be able to be a faithful partner. Or if you engage in masturbation, you won't be able to have a meaningful connection with another person because you've now just only engaged in your own sexual experience with yourself or your sexual relationship with yourself. And the levels of anxiety that set in for a child thinking they may have ruined their future is actually the problem that we're treating when they come in. We're not treating a pornography compulsion. We're treating a shame-based idea of self now because they have this idea that they have ruined something that is irrevocable. And did not understand the normative, like human development, the elements of curiosity that come in at certain times in people's lives. And so when these behaviors are viewed as mistakes and not normal exploration, and then they're given this label of this will harm you no matter what you do in your future. If you do it once, it's over, kind of a thing, really stunts a person's ability to have that come what may mentality of like, I will be able to know if this is harmful or helpful for me. I will be able to see, like, I will be able to have a relationship with another person because I am a normal human and I'm just learning and I love, like be able to look at their own value systems and engage in that. But the idea that they have ruined something as a child that then is irrevocable is actually what I find. That's what we're treating when they come through the door. I'm not actually treating a pornography addiction. I'm treating a shame-based self-loathing, and it's an important distinction to make that we have now caused this issue that we were trying to avoid just by teaching them that they could ruin something.
Which is why I am so sad, right? I'm so sad that misinformation can affect us so deeply. And I don't think that this would be the first time anybody's heard the term self-fulfilling prophecies, right? And we've learned a lot about this through like new parenting models, right? Like if you tell a kid they're lazy long enough, they're going to believe that, and their behavior is going to start being affected by that inner belief that I am a lazy, good for nothing, stupid kid, which is oftentimes, for example, the pain point of ADHD kids who were never diagnosed correctly, especially back 20, 30 years ago when I was being raised. We didn't have a lot of information around ADHD. And so a lot of us were told those kinds of things when we didn't perform in certain ways. And again, even though we can treat ADHD fairly easily, oftentimes what we're treating in therapy now is that undoing of all of that self-messaging of the beliefs people have about themselves. So what we're telling people about themselves really matters. And why this addiction model, in my mind, is so pernicious to begin with is that you're telling somebody that they are diseased because of what we actually know through research is fairly normative human behavior, which is to be curious about other people's sexual behaviors. And, we have like quote unquote porn in caves from back in the day with,
right.
ejaculating and, and different sexual positions. And people have been very curious about sexuality since the beginning of time. It shows up in our cave drawings. It shows up in our poetry. It shows up in our music. It shows up in our literature. And now that we have the ability to, have moving film, it shows up in that format,
right.
right? And so this is not a new issue. We just have new access and more readily available access than ever before. And so we're really living in the biggest porn experiment, of all time. That this is kind of the last 20 years has been the biggest, live porn experiment. And it's so interesting, the myths and how they don't really show up with the actual research and the data. For example, porn irrevocably changes your brain, or porn, like you're saying, ruins your relationship, and porn makes you more deviant, right? Like if you're going to look at porn, it's a slippery slope to becoming a pedophile, right? Or to be a sexual assaulter, that porn will make you objectify women or make you more violent in some sort of way. Or that porn means that you must be dissatisfied sexually with your partner. These are some of the very, very common myths that just abound. And they not only abound in kind of like the media and in colloquial spaces, but actually mental health therapists are also pushing these types of myths because they don't come from, sexually educated, informed practice and training. So these are, of course, there's panic around this stuff. I mean, that's like when you're thinking about your spouse, or you're thinking about your own kids, or you're thinking about yourself, and you're believing these myths that all 5 of those do not have empirical evidence to back them up. Yeah, no wonder we have, a really, really issue. And these are the types of myths that I'm going to be addressing in this, group that I'm going to be starting on November 5th for couples. This group is primarily for people who are dealing with distress about their sexuality, about their porn, how they're going to negotiate that, but want to do it in want to figure out their solutions, which the solutions can look very different for different couples, depending on their values, their beliefs, their ideas, their histories, their traumas. I'm not saying there's a one-way approach, like everybody needs to be okay with porn or everybody needs to not be okay with porn. There's tons of approaches that you can take to this. But I want you to be able to do it in a well-informed, evidence-based, research-supported way.
I think that's a really great point, because there's a lot of like unhelpful information, unhelpful phrases that people use. We brought up a couple today of like, once an addict, always an addict, which is not true at all, because our brains are actually quite malleable and our neural pathways are quite changeable. And so as we learn and grow and adapt to things like that doesn't ring true, but it can be very defeating to hear and be very fearful. Like it can cause a lot of fear with any type of thing that people look at as addictive. And then that leads me to another one, which is everyone's addicted to something. And that came about also, that was very heavy in the Jodi Hildebrandt model that she was using, is that everyone is addicted to something. And so to find out what kind of addict you are, and then looking at everybody and pathologizing every single behavior, was really undermining a lot of relationships, especially with self and things like that. So, I mean, we don't have to like go on and on about her, but that's just one example of how phrases like these can be very unhelpful. And when looking at this group you've got coming up, I think it's important. You brought up a really important point. This is not about finding the right way to look at porn. This is like, there's a lot of different things in between. You might absolutely think that it's the best thing for you and your relationships and absolutely love it. And you might think it's the most dangerous thing on the planet. And then there's a lot in between. And to just ask you, and we only have a couple of minutes left, but to ask you what this group is for and who might benefit most. And I'm assuming you're going to be talking about some of these myths because you really want to disseminate accurate information. And a lot of it is just about sexual education surrounding this major fear that people have. But like, who is this group for? And why might someone want to seek it out? Who might it benefit?
Yeah, well, I think, there is so much pain around this problem. And I think that whether you currently find yourself in a religious system where this kind of goes against, watching sexually explicit material might go against your values.
Sure, yeah.
Or you've left, but you come from that system, right? And so you're still trying to figure out, what do I think about this, and what information And even if I do have new information, there's still been a lot of betrayal or secrecy or pain points around this.
Yes.
Those
Yeah.
kinds of couples, I really hope would consider addressing this. And I think what's also really powerful about a group, some people might be like, "Ooh, that's the last thing I want to talk about in a group setting with other people."
Yeah. What?
It's like, I don't want to talk about my sex life, or I don't want to talk about, these issues that we've had. But wow, is it normalizing and helpful, not just to have, a provider or an expert, but to have other people say, "You know what, me too," or "We went through that as well," or "That's been difficult for us too," or to see how other people negotiate things and go, either we're doing a lot better than they are, and you can find pride in that, or wow, we're doing a lot worse than they are. Why is that? Why are we having more distress about this than they seem to be having? These are all the things that are so helpful in really allowing yourself to be vulnerable in a group setting. And I've done a lot of groups around really, tender topics, from everything from sexual trauma to female sexuality to polyamory. And, so you can see why people would be like, "Oh, do we want to, go in this?"
Yeah.
Going to be vulnerable with other people. But without fail, people are like, "This was amazing. We feel so much camaraderie and support, and not like we're crazy or alone or isolated in things that oftentimes people are very isolated about because they don't know who to go to. They're suffering. They're in so much pain. Oftentimes they don't want to go to family or friends because they don't want people to know that they're struggling, and especially such a like, I don't know, private matter. Want certain reputations to be ruined, or, all those kinds of
right.
stuff. I think if you come from any type of background where you were told some of these myths, where your anxiety is high around this issue, where there's betrayal wounds between you, this would be a good group for you. And we are definitely going to look at, I do welcome gay and lesbian couples to come as well. The reality is that they don't typically show up with a porn dilemma. Gay and lesbian couples are not typically upset about this issue because they have already had to do a lot of sexual deconstruction. They already take usually more sex positive approaches to these kinds of topics. So in my, at least anecdotal experience, it's really been more heterosexual couples who struggle with these wounds that, and I will go into detail about why this is such a deep wound, in particular, usually for the person who identifies as the man, and also why this is such a tender topic and such a wounding space for the person who typically, identifies as the woman in that relationship. Because what is so difficult about the porn dilemma, and especially if you're treating, as a practitioner, is that oftentimes what one person needs to heal and feel safe and feel like trust can be restored kind of feels almost contradictory to what the other person needs to heal and to trust and to feel, like, one person, usually the male, this is also very interesting just as far as research shows, in the mainstream population, men and women are looking at porn. In traditional communities, it trends to be seen more as a problem if the man is looking at porn. And I have worked with people where the woman was looking at porn and the husband found out, and that trends to have a different level of distress. There isn't always a level of distress. Even conservative religious men kind of find that erotic or hot, or, well, wow, let's do that together. Whereas the messaging that's been given to women and to men where the man is looking at porn is a complete threat response for the woman usually. And it's a complete shame response for the man. And so he's needing his shame healed, and she's needing her threat and betrayal healed. And he oftentimes feels like, well, if I'm going to heal you in that, I stay in shame. And she often feels like, well, if I'm going to help you heal with your shame, I need to stay, either
betrayed,
being okay with this, or betrayed, or still threatened. And you can see why I call it a dilemma.
Yeah, it's big, and that is
very tender, and
it's very tender.
Right? The pain and the distress is real. It doesn't always mean that because there's distress that there's a clinical issue, right? We have all kinds of issues that distress us that don't necessarily are not clinical. Like if you have distress over a death, that doesn't mean you're sick, right? So distress is a normal part of life and a normal part of relational negotiations, and the distress can be extremely difficult, to the point that you might show up with clinical symptoms, like somebody who feels betrayed might show up with nightmares or inability to sleep or eat, or inability to focus, because now we can develop anxiety, depression, PTSD from these kinds of distressing events. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the original issue was a clinical one.
Yeah.
Sometimes can lead to the development of a diagnosis.
Right. And I think that's important to know. That's something that I'm also noticing in my practice with couples, is that there's very different work to do, because we're talking about very different wounds, the way that people experience this, the way that people interpret the meaning of things and their position in it. And so to be able to recognize when you're working with a couple, especially a group like this, right, that you're going to be doing, that everybody's doing different work in it, and that the pain points and the distress levels are very, very real. It does not mean anything's wrong with them or anything like that. But if they go unaddressed, like you said, that, eventually you could qualify for full-blown PTSD if we go unaddressed, and we don't understand how to engage with our own distress, and how to engage with clear communication, and how to engage with our separate healing work that we're doing. Because like you said, when we're talking about a couple, they're doing very different work surrounding this thing, but they are doing it adjacent. And so to be able to engage with that. Anyway, I know we might be out of time, but I don't know if there's anything else you want to say about your group coming up. Or
I would just say, you are, as a systemic therapist, as a person who is trained in family and systems and couples therapy, which again, not all therapists are trained in that. It is a complex kind of web, right? And I oftentimes talk to my couples about, we are treating the me, that's one of you. We're treating the you, that's the other one of you, and we're treating the us. And especially with the porn dilemma, there are very distinct tasks and, hopefully effective ways to think about, how do we really look at that triangle, and each one of those entities has their own needs, desires, and we need to address it for each of them. And I think sometimes, in religiously biased therapy, oftentimes the problem gets blamed on the person looking at porn, like, you're the sick one, right? And in secular therapy, oftentimes the person who's having a problem with the porn use is deemed the one with the problem, like, you're the controlling one or the insecure one, and so you're the problem. And it really misses the cultural context, and also the evidence-based information that we should have access to as clinicians. And this is why I see people oftentimes being very harmed by both of those types of approaches. And I've got to admit, I've done a little bit of both of those things, and people have fired me for good reason, because I either let my own religious anxiety or my own new information anxiety to kind of impose that on my clients in ways that was not helpful for them, when they needed really kind of more of a tender dance of, how do you take something as difficult as our history, our values, maybe our shifting values, sometimes not. Sometimes new information, like mixed faith marriages, right? Where one person might be, creating different types of ideas and values around their sexuality, and the other person's like, hold on, I'm not signing up for this. This is not what I signed up for. That's very tender. And you can't just minimize or pathologize one person's experience in that systemic group that is as complicated as one couple. And so it really is, and I've really dedicated so much of my career and my training and, podcasts on my show, interviewing, top-notch professionals around this topic, to really start helping couples learn how to negotiate this. Because for the most part, this, I don't think that this is a necessary reason for a partnership to dissolve. I don't think it has to be as panicky as we've been taught to believe. And I think that there are good tools and effective ways to negotiate and manage the wounds of both parties, so that that relationship can flourish. And not just in survival mode, right? Like, we can stay married, but in thriving mode. And where I include thriving is sexual, eroticism being something that is shared in a way that both partners are really feeling satisfied with, right? So that, of course, this porn dilemma can super interfere with the erotic sexual intimacy of a partner. Even if they remain emotionally intimate or intellectually intimate, they may not always know how to remain sexually intimate. And I'm really hopeful that people can find ways to reclaim their relationship, understand the information, decide what their values and negotiations are going to look like going forward in ways that attend to their individual wounds and the couple thriving.
Yeah, and to deepen the connection as a couple. Okay, thank you. Thank you for talking to me.
I hope that as a burgeoning professional, you were like, okay, this makes sense. Or, I don't know if I addressed all your questions, but is there anything else that you'd like that's coming up for you?
Well, you know me, I have a million questions about everything, but it's also worth continuing conversation, right? But as things unfold with general practice and just like watching what's happening, I think having a conversation that is allowable is often one of the best things for individuals, communities, families, knowing that this topic we're allowed to talk about it, we're allowed to explore it, and that it can take a long time. This isn't a one and done conversation where you're going to have all these solutions, but being able to open up our minds to like, what is our experience really? How do we want our connection to be really? What's affecting that really? And so looking at something as deep and tender as a porn dilemma, as one specific thing, because at the end of the day, we're all really looking for healthy ways to keep our connections and to build and have them work. And so anyway, I just think these conversations are so important to have them be safe and allowable and objective.
Yeah, agreed. I agree with that. So a little bit more information. This group that I'm talking about is a 7-week group. It is online. So you can join me from anywhere in the country. I've even had international folks join me in some of these groups. It is an educational support group. So it's not like a classic therapy group. So you don't enter into a therapeutic relationship with me, but it is, supportive and educational. And it's all done, even though it's not official therapy, it's all done through HIPAA compliant, confidential, spaces. So your confidentiality will be very much protected. I also want to say that we do have financial resources. So if you can't afford to attend the group, you can always contact our practice at simcounseling.com to see if you would be eligible for financial aid. I don't want necessarily finances to keep people from getting the help that they need. And also, if you're not interested in a group, because that feels a little bit too, like I said, vulnerable to be with other folks quite yet, I am training people like Rachel. Rachel, is training to become a sex therapist herself. All of the providers here at Symmetry Counseling can help with that. I would also recommend, if you don't go through us, to check out organizations like asect.org, which is AASECT.org. Those providers on their therapy directory are all going to be certified sex therapists. And also, if you happen to come from the LDS or Mormon community, I would encourage you to look at the Mormon Mental Health Association, who also has a great directory. And although not all of them are sex certified, many of them also agree to not practice ineffective treatment in regards to pornography. That's actually part of our position statements and part of agreeing to our bylaws and agreements to be, part of that association, to practice ethical work that is evidence-based. So those are some resources for everyone. And thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much, Rachel, for your really well thought out questions and for being willing to do this with me.
Yes, thank you. Loved it.
Take care, everyone. Good night.
Thank you for listening to the Natasha Helfer podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. To watch the video of this podcast, you can subscribe to Natasha's channel on YouTube and follow her professional page at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CST-S. You can find all her core resources at natashahelfer.com. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or feelings of Natasha Helfer or the Natasha Helfer podcast. We provide a platform for open and diverse discussions and it is important to recognize that different perspectives may be shared. We encourage our listeners to engage in critical thinking and form their own opinions. The intro and outro music for these episodes are by Otter Creek. Thank you for listening.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. Now tishki say the Navajo, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. 10,000 years of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. Now tishki say the Navajo, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. Now tishki say the Navajo, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart.